Welcome back to the channel, everybody. We have already painted one alternate Gargant on this show, and today we're going to be painting another one, and this is the most Garganty Gargant of them all. He's huge. Previously on this channel, we painted up the Mega-Gargant, which is the same height as a Games Workshop Mega-Gargant. However, he was rather skinny, and compared to this model, not only is he a little bit taller than the Mega-Gargant, but as you can clearly tell, he's much more chunky. And while the Mega-Gargant cost us $40, this one cost us only $20. Well, 20 for me. I did get the STL file on sale, and, well, I have a 3D printer, so it may cost you a little bit more, but if you have all those things, hey, you could print one out for about $20 yourself. So this is going to be a very, literally large project, very huge. I would have rather preferred to tackle it in sections, but there were huge gaps, and so that took a lot of putty, a lot of filling, and there's no easy breakaway points here with the separate arms. Can't leave those off. So we're going to be painting it up all in one piece. And how are we going to paint this? Don't have a clue. Went into this with just a barest idea is what I wanted, and, well, you already saw the beginning, so you know how it turned out. Let's find out how we got there. So after primer, I gave this big boy a coat of Vallejo Camo Black Brown just to start with. That gives us our dark layer, keeps the shadows dark, so we don't have to paint every single little nook and cranny on this big boy. And the skin obviously is the main subject of this project. He has a lot of skin, so we need to do something a little bit fun with it. As I said, going into this, I only had the barest ideas of what to do, and the best thing I could come up with was go for a sort of orange, slight orange tinted skin. I was thinking Dungeons & Dragons Hill Giant in my mind, so that's what I decided to start with, and then figure out where that takes me. Start off with an undercoat of Vallejo Model Color Hull Red, and now I'm coating that with red leather. Now, both of these colors are mostly going to get covered up by the time we get to the end, but this is our jumping off point. This is going to add some warmth to our skin and make it easier to build up to a more orange color flesh tone. And this is where we have tip number 1, your brush selection. We have a huge surface that needs to be covered here, so we need to use large brushes, and for a majority of this project I'm using number 6 and number 8 sized flats, because we need to cover a huge surface here, and for the most part we are starting off with a very heavy dry brush. Brush strokes are not an issue now, because we're going to take care of them as we go on. Building up from our red leather undercoat, starting to apply some model color light brown, and this is starting to introduce our orange tone to the skin. We are continuing with the dry brushing, best way to cover such a large surface area, and we're going to be covering up a majority of those previous 2 layers of paint, the Camo Black Brown and the Hull Red. Now, the dry brushing is not going to completely cover up the red leather. Some of it's still going to show through, which is a good thing. We're actually going to do 2 coats of this light brown. First, an overall dry brush, and then we're going to go back a second time, a little bit lighter, starting to concentrate more on the base coat and highlight areas with that second coat. So that's going to bring in more of that light brown cover and cover up more of the red leather. Our next highlight color is light brown mixed with game color elf flesh. It's about a 50-50 mix, and you can see here this dry brush is much lighter, and we can still see those underlying colors shining through. This is going to be actually one of the last of our highlights for the moment, because now we're going to start to add some color to the skin and start to tweak things a little bit. And that brings me to this video's tip number 2. Elf flesh works on everything. Okay, well, not literally, but elf skin tone has recently become one of the colors that I go to when I don't know what color I want to use. It works very well for highlighting an orange-brown color, for highlighting flesh. for adding to browns for highlights, even adding to reds. It's quite universal. I haven't used it on everything, but I've used it quite a bit, so that makes it a star in my book. I decided to add one more highlight off camera by adding some model color desert yellow to our previous mix, but now I'm starting to add some color. I decided to give it a glaze of game color terracotta, and this is going to add a little bit more of that red warmth to our skin tone because I felt I was starting to lose it. We had a really nice color in the beginning, but in the end here I started to cover it up a little bit more. So this is going to introduce red back into the skin tone, and it's also going to, tip number 3, it's going to start to cover up some of our dry brushing marks, because basically we're putting a glaze over all those dry brush marks as well, and so that's going to help to soften them so they don't look as rough. We've done a lot of highlighting on this model. We just started the glazes. We got a lot more glazing to do, but one thing I've neglected so far is the shade areas. We need to define the shade areas on our model and also add a little bit of color there. And even though I'm adding some red with that last glaze, I'm still going with the orange theme on this model. So some deep orange mixed with light brown, and this is thinned, and I'm layering this into our recessed area to darken it, also to give it a little bit of color. And once again, because we are putting this on with thinned paint, it is once again obscuring our dry brushing, and all that quick dry brushing we did at the beginning, it's slowly disappearing. You can barely see it now. Once we are completely done, you shouldn't see any of it at all. Occasionally during a project, you'll kind of feel yourself kind of losing grasp of what you initially wanted. In this case, I still felt I was moving too far away from the orange color that I initially wanted. So decided to give it a heavy glaze. This is a mix of Parasite Brown with deep orange. And this is going to tint everything, of course, more orange. It's going to tint our highlights, our base coat, and our shade. However, want to make it very clear here, this is not starting from scratch. What this is more like changing direction slightly. Just by changing the color tone of the model, we can shift directions of where we go from here. And this is not repainting everything. This is just adding to what is already there. And while it feels like we're covering up all the work we already did, no, actually we're adding to the work we already did. While some of those areas might get a little bit more obscured, we couldn't do this glaze if it was not for all those previous layers that are already on the miniature. So while it may seem like I'm just covering up all the work I already did, actually I'm kind of adding to it and adding more subtle variations to the model. Because our orange glaze reduced our highlights, we need to do a reapplication of some of them, but we don't necessarily have to use the exact same colors. Because we've tweaked the previous layers quite a bit by adding that orange tone to it, then we have to adjust the highlight colors that we're adding on top. And so now I am using just pure straight game color elf skin tone. And to that I've added some glaze medium. The purpose of that is to slow down the dry time of our elf skin tone. While it looks like I'm dry brushing this on, I'm not. I actually have the paint thinned. It just looks like that because I'm using a really big brush to paint these big surface areas. So I'm using the big brush for the application, and then I'm softening the edge of those highlights to blend them into the previous layer. And this is done in 2 coats actually. I'm using the big brush for like the big belly and the chest, and then the smaller details like the knuckles and all that, I'm going in with a regular size number 2 brush to paint those. We finally reached the point of our final highlight, elf skin tone mixed with basic skin tone. And you can see we switched over to our relatively, comparatively smaller number 2 brush. And this final highlight is just going into the areas wherever there's wrinkles. For example, the belly, big round belly, we don't have any sharp edges there to highlight. However, in the face, we got a lot more wrinkles. We want to make those really pronounced. And also in the arm, as you can see right there, we want you to see every little fold in this model because unfortunately there's just not a whole lot to show. So the ones that are there, we really want to highlight. We're finally done with the highlighting, so time to move on to the shading. Now we don't want to just paint black or dark brown into our shade areas. We want to add something a little bit more colorful there as well. And keeping in with our slightly orange-hued skin tone, mixed up red ink and yellow ink to make orange, and then I darkened it with brown ink. Now the reason for switching over to inks is because inks are very transparent and it will allow me to put down color without obscuring the details that are underneath. We already have a little bit of shade going on and I don't want to obscure that. So this is going to add orange to our shade areas without covering up all the previous layers of paint that are still in those recesses. With that done, now we can add a little bit more of a dark tone to our shade areas. And using kind of a funky mix for that, decided to introduce a little bit of violet to the scheme. So I have a mix of leather brown and hexed lichen. And this is thin once again, and we're just placing it right into the recesses. Very easy to do when you have a very large model. Of course, paint is thinned as usual, and we're just slowly building up a dark color, just like we normally would with a highlight. And then using this same color, I decided to add some liver spots to the hands and the chest and the head. Not too many, just a few spots to break up this very large chunk of skin we have on this model. The only difference here is I once again added glaze medium because that's going to make our mixture here much more transparent and it will make the spots look like they are a part of the skin or under the skin rather than just sitting on top of the skin. Adding some variation to skin tones is very important. It makes them look much more realistic if you add a little bit of warmth here and there, especially to areas like the nose and the ears and the cheeks. I normally use gory red for adding some color to skin tones, but in this case I went with magenta, and I have this extremely thin. This is not much more than colored water, and I'm slowly building up the layers so the color transition is very smooth, and I'm trying to get very bright ear and nose, which really breaks up a very plain face, adds a little bit more interest in color, and draws your eye towards the face. Time to paint some toenails. Now, for regular human skin tone, usually all you need to do is add a little bit of white to whatever your skin tone color is. But when they're this big and thick and you want to make them dirty, well, then we're going to use a different color for that. Simply use some model color desert yellow, and I'm adding some pale sand to that for the highlights. And to make them look a bit more jagged, we have the paint a little bit thicker here, and we're painting with texture. So there's little splits and lines in the toenails, making them all look pretty icky. Now we could finally move on to painting the rest of the model, and as you can see, this is a big chunky model. It's not really, doesn't have any fine details on it, and I just kind of want to get it painted at this point, so we're going to be speeding up the process a little bit. For his leg and arm wraps, began with the base coat of model color khaki, and then I gave it a very heavy wash of olive brown, a very thick paint wash. And this is going to darken our khaki. It's going to shade it, but it's still going to collect in the deeper recesses. Then once it's dry, I'm going to go back and reapply the khaki and then add one highlight with khaki and pale sand. So that's 3 coats of paint, but we're actually getting 4 layers out of it because of the tinted khaki, the reapplied khaki, the olive brown in the recesses, and of course the pale sand and khaki highlight. We have a little bit of metal to paint on this model, and of course we don't want to do the knight in shining armor look on this big gnarly Titan. The metal is Vallejo Model Air steel mixed with a heavy amount of model color black, and that's going to give us a nice dark iron look. And then over that I've dry brushed a slightly lighter version of that color with more steel in it. And now I'm adding some green ink as a wash to add some shade. I was initially planning on using rust, but with all the orange in the skin tone, I decided not to go with that. Plus we have a lot of brown elsewhere on the model. Adding green to the steel gives it a very interesting weathered look to it, I feel. I found it works very well on like dwarves. Just adds an earthiness to the metal, and I think it works very well here. Not much to say about painting the pants. Once again, just big flat areas, not a huge amount of highlighting or shading to do. I just picked a base color and then applied 2 highlights, and that was about it. I did add 1 shade layer, but this is also shading pretty much the entire region. This is like doing the dip method, but with a brush. After painting the stitches, I went back in with a very heavy wash of black mixed with camo black brown. Almost pure black essentially, and now I'm piling that into the areas between all the patches, and that's really going to highlight all those stitches, give them a nice dark edge. And then I'm also bringing this color out to any of the areas on the pants where we need a little bit of extra shade. Perfect example, back of that leg right there with that red color. We do have a fold there that's going to need some extra shade, so I'm just going to draw that color into that section as well. Draw the our blackish wash into those sections. One of the annoying things to paint on this model was the net, because it's not really a net, it's a solid object. Clearly it's not open inside. Now my first thought was to paint the inside black, like somehow that was going to trick anybody, but instead I decided to actually highlight it. Started off with Hull Red for the bag inside the net, that's what I'm calling it, and now I'm dry brushing the net portion with Desert Yellow. So I'm trying to give the impression that there's a bag inside the net to hopefully hide that blocky area of the model, and this is the best way I can figure out to paint it. Once the dry brushing is done, I'll go back and clean up the Hull Red a little bit, and then I'm going to give that same very dark wash that I did on the pants. And you know what? It works out pretty good. Now, one of the coolest things on this model is this big honkin' turtle shell that he has on the back of his belt. Now, if you look up tortoises, or torti, whatever the correct word is, or turtles, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different patterns you could paint on shells like this. However, this was getting towards the end of the project, and I kind of just wanted to get her done. Started off with Hull Red, and then we painted it with Parasite Brown, and now I'm using Desert Yellow. And I painted all that using texture, so that's slightly thicker paint, so you actually see the brush strokes, and that's going to give a little bit of texture. Makes the shell look like it's very heavy and chipped a little bit. It has some weight to it. And despite the very simple paint job, just 3 coats, it came out very well. I'm actually kind of sorry I didn't record more of this section. Very simple, but I think it really adds to the piece. We're at the end here. This is the time for doing the cleanup work, checking our highlights, our shades, fixing anything we missed, adding a few little details here and there. One of those details are the big wounds on the belly. Now, in scale, these wounds are huge. They're the size of a man, and I really didn't want to paint them all bloody because that would have been a whole lot of blood on the model. Instead, I decided to paint them like they're bruised. I decided to use the exact same glaze technique that we used for the magenta on the face, this time using medium blue first, then once that's dry, applying violet. And that's it. We are done with our Mega-Gargant Cyclops Titan giant thing. Anyway, he's big. Believe it or not, I actually thought I could paint this in one day. And yeah, that didn't happen. It actually took 3 weeks to finish. So this is one of the biggest things I ever painted, and I definitely do not want to do it again. But overall, I kind of like the results. We got a good skin tone here. It's a little on the plain side. I really wanted to add something to it, but I couldn't decide what to do. Thought about doing hair, but he's already bald-headed. He has no eyebrows, so painting chest hair seemed very weird. Thought about doing tattoos, but if I didn't like them, well, fixing a tattoo on a small 28mm human is no big deal. Fixing tattoos on a giant, literal giant, that's a much bigger deal. I'd have to repaint all the skin if I didn't like it, and decided I didn't want to do that. Now, the main negative to this quote-unquote miniature is that it's very blocky and lacks detail. It really feels like it was a very small 2-inch figure that was blown up to 7 inches. And there's a lot of dead areas, there's a lot more details you could add, and they're just unfortunately not there. Although I do admit the kind of blocky style, it does have a little bit of appeal to it, and if you had all the time in the world, you could definitely spend a lot of time adding a whole bunch of details on these big, flat, unadorned areas on the model. But for me, 3 weeks of work is more than plenty for a model like this, so I'm going to call it quits. I hope this video helps you, gives you some inspiration, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Oh my goodness, I'm growing so fast I'm giving myself a wedgie!
Oh,